Episode 6 of Frozen Planet 2 is called Our Frozen Planet, and it's all about the impacts of climate change on the environment. So we open up in Greenland. Here we see the Greenland ice caps. We see how the glaciers are melting. It's pretty horrific. We kind of touched on that earlier in the series, so it kind of just follows on from that, but with actual scientists to kind of back up what's going on. And yep, just as effective as it was earlier in the series. Then we move on to talk about the melting sea ice, which again, we know is pretty bad. We focus mainly on the harp seals. Again, that was a sequence earlier in the series that kind of tugged on the heartstrings, and it continues to discuss how bleak things are because obviously the harp seals return to the same areas to have their pups, and as those areas are currently covered in ice and they may no longer be covered in ice, that will mean that the harp seals realistically will no longer be able to breed and will likely go extinct. Pretty harrowing stuff, because harp seals are really cute as well, and you see a lot of them, you see them tagging them as well, so even when they're no longer, white and fluffy, they're still pretty adorable to look at. It makes even more sad. Again, it was a very smart decision, I think, to talk about harp seals, because they're an animal that I think we can get behind, like everyone likes. So I think, yeah, very good stuff. Very harrowing, very depressing, to be honest with you. There's a lot of that in this episode. This is just the first of many sequences. And then we talk about polar bears. We talk about polar bears ending up inland when the sea ice melts. And a lot of them end up quite far inland, particularly around dumps. Because there's nothing really substantial to eat, a lot of them are starving. We see one get rescued and get brought back to the coast, but that isn't the norm. They do a good job of explaining how the ice reflects heat. And then obviously when the ocean's a lot darker, it absorbs it, causing more ice to melt. So that was worth talking about. And as we move away from the high Arctic, we visit the tundra. Here we talk about the permafrost melting, which is something we touched on last episode, but we go into a lot more detail here. How obviously the tundra is eroding because the permafrost is melting, causing the soil to turn to sludge, and this is causing all these lakes to pop up. And because the permafrost contains so much methane, and that is gradually being released, this is just accelerating climate change. Because methane is 30 times more effective at trapping heat than carbon dioxide, which is the main issue right now, it's just going to make things even worse. And as the permafrost is gradually melting, that is just going to get faster and faster, and eventually the vast majority of it is going to be released in like one big go. And at that point, I mean, there's nothing we could really do. We've yet to reach the point where climate change is completely irreversible. Unfortunately, when that happens, that will be the point at which we can do nothing. So at that point, again, as I say, there isn't really a future. I like how they did talk about that, because that's the thing that scares me the most of all the things to do with climate change. So I'm glad they did talk about that, because I don't think we talk about it enough. I don't think many people are actually aware of it. We're all aware of the polar bears and all that stuff. We don't really know too much about that, and that is the thing that's ultimately going to be the final nail in the coffin. So I'm glad they highlighted that. We also talked about the indigenous people in the high Arctic, how a lot of them use dog sled to cross the ice. Unfortunately, they can't do that anymore because the ice is breaking up. Eventually, that's going to be completely impossible for them to travel, and their way of life will disappear. So quite harrowing as well, pretty depressing. Again, something we don't highlight too often, but I think it's important because of the people that live there, and they're the ones that are going to be the most affected by it. Then we talk about mountain glaciers, how they're melting. We highlighted that in the mountain episode, and they highlight that the meltwater from these glaciers directly impacts the flow of water into many of these major rivers that feed southern Asia. So obviously, as that water is going to go, when the glaciers go, these rivers will dry up, especially in the summer months. So that's pretty bad, and that will lead to massive water shortages and realistically wars. This is a part of the world that's already quite volatile, so this is just going to be another pressure added to that. And as we get further south, we move to Antarctica. Here we spend quite a bit of time with Adelie penguins. So the Adelie penguins were actually quite good to see, actually, because they were a major staple in the Frozen Planet 1. A lot of the highlights from that series were the Adelie penguins. So much like the harp seal, it was very smart of them to talk about the Adelie penguins, talking about how they're really struggling, how their populations are in decline, and how a lot of them have abandoned some of their old nesting sites. They kind of repeated the same thing they did with the chinstrap penguins, where we see the chicks getting waterlogged feathers, which causes them to get hypothermia, so much so that they're not even able to fight off the skuas. We see one chick that sounds like it's been eaten alive with the skuas. Pretty horrible, to be honest with you. What was actually surprisingly even more harrowing than that, though, where the main scientist we're following goes to the old Adelie nesting site, and you see all the pebbles that are still there, and this is very well done, because it reminds you very much of Frozen Planet 1. That really funny sequence where the Adelie penguins were stealing each other's pebbles, really fun stuff, that's gone now, at least in this colony, and that's really depressing, and the guy's crying, and I'll be honest with you, I felt it as well. I generally felt quite emotional watching that, more so than I did towards anything else in the episode, and I think just because it adds that nostalgia to it, and because it shows you, the viewer, someone who watched Frozen Planet back when it came out in 2011, and saw the Adelie penguin sequence in that series, and now it's just gone, it does cut even deeper, I think, than it would have done normally, so I think that was a very good decision to use that, and again, it's the only time Adelie penguins pop up in this series, and I'm really glad at how impactful it was. So yeah, that was very good. That was probably the highlight of the episode for me. And then the last major bit we talk about is the melting ice in the Antarctica, and how the water underneath the ice is warmer. So it's actually melting the ice from the bottom up. In the Arctic, we're very used to seeing the ice melting from the top, so it's very obvious. In Antarctica, it's less so, and we don't really talk about it as much. Here we see that the same thing is happening, it's just not as obvious, and they highlight the impacts of that. How a lot of our major cities are on the coast. All these places are probably going to be underwater at some point, relatively soon, and that should really raise concern. And we end the episode talking about how things aren't too late, how we can make a difference, and again, Amber really hammers home the point. However, what I will say, I did feel very depressed when I watched this the first time. I felt very depressed watching it again, because in 2022 it was pretty harrowing, but at least we kind of thought there maybe was some hope. Now, in the current political climate that we're in, that hope is just running out. I think I really struggle to see a positive outcome in the long run, especially with all the things we're talking about in this episode. It really does paint a fairly bleak picture. So yeah, this episode is pretty good actually. It's better than I remember it. I remember the first time having issues with it being too depressing and not really inspiring enough hope, but it does attempt to do that. The problem is that just so many bad things are happening, and a lot of them are pretty irreversible, that it's really hard to be optimistic. So in fairness, that's not really the episode's fault, and I actually did appreciate it a lot more the second time round. I'm glad they talked about the permafrost, I'm glad they talked about the indigenous communities and the impacts on them, I'm glad they talked about the water running out in southern Asia, a lot of things that you wouldn't think to talk about, which I'm glad they put to the forefront. Very good stuff. Yeah, this series was pretty good. I actually really enjoyed this series, a lot more than I did the first time. I still don't think it's as good as Frozen Planet, I think that's just got a very tight narrative. But this series was a lot better than I remember it being. It's definitely what I'm glad I rewatched. So yeah, let me know in the comments below what you think of this episode. What were your highlights? Let me know in the comments below. As ever, feel free to let me know what you'd like me to talk about next. I will be doing a top 10 list next, but feel free to let me know what you'd like me to talk about next. I am planning to do that Walking with Dinosaurs reboot when I get a chance to watch that, so I'll do that at some point, probably just a series review. I don't think I'm going to be doing episodes reviews for that one. And yeah, as ever, feel free to like, comment and subscribe, or don't if you don't want to. It's perfectly fine. I'll see you next week, and goodbye.